Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Mass Medic webinar where we feature experts from our membership community to talk about issues that are impacting our medtech community. We are thrilled today to bring you the first of 3 webinars that we've partnered with Medidata on to talk about what I call the after, the after of COVID. So we're really drilling down on clinical trials, and in particular, everything you need to know about clinical trials in this day and age. So today's webinar is about reconsidering trial design to ensure data capture in the COVID-19 era. I'm really pleased today to have 2 experts from Medidata join us to drive this train. We have Paul O'Donoghue and Michael Tucker. Paul and Michael are going to talk about their roles at Medidata briefly, and then we're going to go into the presentation. Just a few housekeeping notes for you. We have a chat feature you can see it in the bottom of your screen, a little chat bubble. That's where we're going to be collecting questions throughout the presentation. The presentation will go for about 45 minutes. Please feel free to submit your questions anytime through the chat function. I will host that Q&A at around 1:45. And a couple other things, if you should all be on mute if you're not presenting. If by any chance you do find yourself off mute, please make sure to mute your line so that our presenters can go through their presentation. And finally, we will make available both the video and the slides from this presentation to all registrants of the webinar following the program. And that should be it. I am Brian Johnson. I'm the president of Mass Medic. I'm thrilled to be working with Medidata. It's a fantastic company. I had the pleasure last year of speaking at their conference in New York City. I don't think it's going to be happening this year, but that's why we think it's really timely now to talk about these issues. So, Paul and Michael, I'm going to leave it in your capable hands. Thank you for joining us, and please take it away and enlighten us on clinical trials in the COVID era.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you so much to Mass Medic as well for giving us the opportunity to chat to you today, and thank you everyone for joining us for the next 45 minutes or so while myself and Michael talk to you about technology, and particularly technology in the light of COVID-19 within the clinical trial space. Briefly, to introduce myself, I'm Paul O'Donoghue. I'm scientific lead for eco and mobile health here at Medidata. So I'm really responsible for ensuring we as a company, but also our partners, sponsors, and clients are following industry, regulatory, and scientific best practices when it comes to using these technologies in trials. Very, very happy to be joined by my friend and colleague, Michael Tucker, who will introduce himself momentarily, but I just briefly wanted to give everyone a sense of kind of the 3 key themes that we're hoping to talk to you today about. Really, firstly, how we've seen the clinical trial landscape change over the years, and particularly most recently, really in response to a lot of the technologies that are starting to become available and starting to become more integrated within the clinical trial space. And then we'll dig into a bit more detail, or should I say Michael will dig into a bit more detail around how these technologies can actually be used to support and empower patients within clinical trials, again, particularly in light to some of the challenges we're seeing as a response to COVID-19. And then we obviously have some time set aside to specifically talk to what we've seen as a company, some of the impacts on clinical trials of COVID-19, specifically around patient data capture, some of the things we've seen impacted there, and some of the solutions and responses we, Medidata, have been involved in, but also the broader industry and the regulators. So very excited to talk to you about these things today. And as Brian said, please do submit your questions if you have any, and we'll try and get to those at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my friend Michael, who will introduce himself and dive into these topics. Michael.
All right. Thank you, Paul. My name is Michael Tucker. I'm a senior product solution specialist with Medidata. It just means I'm more of a consultant to you as in the industry and to our internal teams on a few key areas. I've worked in in clinical trials now for about 10 years. Prior to that, I was in preclinical for 20 years, both conducting research as well as supporting research. And I will say it's much easier to work with one species than the many species I worked with before. So my focus in clinical trials has been primarily on patient-centric technologies like e-consent and virtual trials, and really seeing a vast change in the industry, as Paul said. What's been driving that change over the past 15, 20 years has been this patient awakening, or this awakening to patients, perhaps, as we think about it, where patients are now more aware of what's going on in the world around them and have more information at their fingertips through different avenues, like through news organizations. I remember during the first Gulf War, I was introduced to 24-hour news for the first time, learning about what was going on around the world. And as we've seen this perpetuation of always on, always active accessibility to information, we also find a very much more engaged and much more educated client base or customer base coming to us from a patient perspective, where patients learn about studies and learn about their conditions out there. They're more social in sharing information back and forth, and now more than ever before, they're better informed because of the access they have to all of the different types of materials that are available out there through scientific journals, and looking at studies that have been conducted previously, being able to go out and look at clinicaltrials.gov and see how trials have been conducted and information that's available to them. Let's go to the next slide, Paul. So we've seen this major change in the industry, where today patients are more aware, they're more technology driven, and they're more informed than ever before. And they invest their time in learning about their diseases. They invest their time learning about medical devices, locations where the trials are being conducted, and learning more about the results from similar trials that have been conducted before, so that they can come in as a better informed patient to decide whether or not they want to participate in your clinical trials. So it also brings its own set of challenges, where patients have expectations that many of the things they've seen in the day-to-day operations of their lives using smartphones and devices should be available to them in the clinical trials that they participate in as well. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the big changes we've seen in the industry over the past 20, 25 years is clearly technology and the accessibility to a patient on the technology platform. These days, we have the ability to deliver information to patients and capture information from patients through just about any type of medium, any type of device they might have that's connected to the internet, whether it's through a laptop, a desktop, a tablet, or a smartphone, even through through watches and other types of devices, where we're starting to capture data from patients on a day-to-day basis. So this whole move in technology has made it much easier for us to not only educate patients, but for them to be more engaged in the clinical trials. Let's go to the next slide. We've also seen this incredible change, as you can see here, the world population. I think I took this screenshot about 2 weeks ago. The world population was approaching 7.8 billion people. And of that 7.8 billion people, more than 59% actually are active internet users, and have and more than half are unique mobile internet users. So over half the world has the internet at their fingertips on any given day, 24 hours a day. Let's go to the next slide. This one, I think, as we talk about the focus on patients, one of the things that we've not done well in the industry up until recently is the whole focus of designing technology and designing products that are driven by the patient's interest in the clinical trial, the patient's participation, finding ways to engage them more effectively. We started utilizing a concept of patient centricity by design, which is this process where the patient perspective is brought into everything we do in the software design, the software development, the testing, the release of software, so that as we put software into the hands of other patients, it's gone through this process of getting approved by their fellow patients, people who would say, this makes no sense if you put this button over here, or if you do these types of things. So it gives us accountability, visibility, scalability, and repeatability in the way that we deliver technology to the patients themselves. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so part of our patient centricity by design process includes what we would consider patient workshops and engaging the patients and advisors in helping to develop the different thought processes, process flow, getting a lot of different opinions. You can see here, this was released just this week actually, and is available to you. The Economist Intelligence Unit has developed this State of Patient Centricity 2020 white paper. You can see some of the key people there that you may recognize from the industry, like Ken Getz and Jeff Kasher and TJ Sharp, Craig Lipset, and others that are key thought leaders that are really focused in on what is it going to take to engage patients more effectively in clinical trials, and what is this whole idea of advancing from patient first intentions to a true co-creation of technology in the industry. Let's go to the next slide. So as you think about the patient journey, when a patient enters your trial, there are a lot of different touch points that today we expect the patients to be engaged with. First of all, they've got to find your study. So going out and finding where your study is being conducted, what the trial is about, going out to clinicaltrials.gov, looking through their EHR or talking with a clinician, being part of a disease registry, somehow learning about a trial that might be out there, going to a site, engaging with the site, finding out about what does it mean to participate in your clinical trial, going through a consent process, and then deciding if they want to join the study, being randomized onto the study, and starting to share their information through different types of technologies that might be available to them. In some cases, you're still using paper on some of these studies where you're capturing a journal or a diary from a patient. But looking at tools and technologies like eCOA to be able to more effectively manage that and capture that, being able to virtualize and decentralize your clinical trials through different types of platforms and technologies, and being able to start to capture information through wearable sensors as well. The incredible amount of data that we can capture through a sensor that's picking up 20 million data points on any given day, and then be able to sort through that smartly and be able to filter through and find the relevant data that will help us to look at the endpoints, the digital endpoints or the digital biomarkers that may be necessary to understand the human condition on your particular trial. And I think lastly, and most importantly, perhaps, is this whole concept of including the patient in sharing their data back to them. This concept of data return, something that's fairly new to the industry, but in 2016, the NIH was a little bit forward thinking and said, let's make sure that every patient who participates in an NIH trial has access to the data on that trial, understand what the trial was about and how it was a successful trial or not. But more important than that is perhaps giving them their own data, the raw data that they've shared with you on the trial, back to them that they can include in their EHR or EMR. So all of these touch points that we see throughout the patient journey are different areas where we can utilize technology to impact the trial itself, but to engage with the patient and make them more willing to share information with us, or encourage them to be more willing to share information with us, and be able to show a reward for them at the end of the study as well, where they can gain access to the data, their lab results, and continue standard of care after the clinical trial is over. Let's go to the next slide. So as we think about some of these technologies, I focus in on a couple of them today, one being electronic informed consent or e-consent, and especially in this day and age with COVID-19, how do we go about sharing that information, or how do we go about capturing information from a patient on a clinical trial and engaging them in participation in that trial? And as we look at e-consent, there are a number of different guidance documents that have popped up in the past several months because of COVID-19 that really affect the way that we conduct our trials. There's guidance documents in the EU, guidance documents in the UK, and guidance documents in the US. There's some that are popping up in Japan and Asia and various places that help people who are participating or excuse me, running a clinical trial, whether it's a device-related trial or a drug-related trial, in understanding how to engage with those patients who may be behind a barrier. They may be in a ICU, or they may be homebound and not able to participate. Let's go to the next slide. So as we think about those different guidance documents, some of the ones that focus on e-consent, remote consent, are the FDA guidance on the use of electronic informed consent that came out in 2016, largely driven by some of the early studies that we did as an industry on virtual trials as well as e-consent. But really focusing in on the protection of the patient and making sure that we do everything we can to engage the patient effectively and be able to measure their comprehension, measure how they participate, and be able to allow them to decide whether or not they want to participate after they've learned about the trial through some electronic means. Let's go to the next slide. As we enter the COVID-19 era, there have been a couple of key factors in the guidance documents that have been released that really drive how we approach those patients. So the first one came out in late April, March, and was focused on identifying patients in isolation, how we can reach those patients, and finding ways around the current status or current status quo of collecting consent, and instead allowing patients that might not be able to share a paper document to utilize electronic informed consent, or if electronic informed consent was not available, to be able to capture that information on a smartphone and be able to send pictures of the consent document or scan it in some fashion, getting the consent document out of the room where the patient is. But also making sure that there's some attestation to that consent process taking place. And then later in April, early April, there was an update to this guidance document that came out that talks specifically about patients who are unable to travel to a clinical site. First and foremost, we should be focused on patient safety, but as patients are able to participate remotely, being able to give them technologies or give them the ability to share their consent to participate in a clinical trial, even though they're not in a face-to-face scenario. I think the key pieces that come out of this guidance is that we should always be mindful of the fact that that process is a direct process between an investigator and the patient, and that process shouldn't be obviated by the use of technology. You should still maintain that relationship between the investigator and the patient in any fashion you can, whether it's through a telephone call, through telemedicine, or other types of technology that can connect the two of those to make sure that questions are answered, make sure the patient has had enough information or enough time with the information to make the decision, and make sure that the investigator can assure that the patient is competent to make the informed consent decision prior to signing a document, whether it's electronic or by paper. Let's go to the next slide. From a UK perspective and EU perspective, there are some very distinct documents that have come out that have focused on remote consent as well. One is the MHRA joint statement that they put out in 2018 that helped us understand in the UK how we can use e-consent and how we can use remote consent. More recently with COVID-19, making sure that trial participants are able to consent to any identifiers leaving the site and being assured that their confidentiality will be protected. So in addition to the consent that you're providing to the patient in the UK, making sure that they're consenting to their data leaving the site and going elsewhere from the site, especially if you're using an electronic system. In the EU, making sure that that we provide a way for patients to be able to consent from home if possible, and if written consent by the participant isn't possible, being able to give oral consent in the presence of an impartial witness. And this can include utilizing things like telemedicine, where you can view the patient and share a telemedicine like we are today, right? We're using Zoom. There's Zoom for healthcare and other types of technology out there that could be used to engage multiple parties in that consent process to ensure that the patient is not being induced, making sure that they're not being encouraged to join a study without being given the full opportunity to evaluate the information. Ultimately, in the European Union, it's up to the member state and the ethics committee to approve the changes to the consent process. In the UK, they've said it's not requiring a substantial change to the or amendment to the protocol, but instead to go ahead and put in place those capabilities to engage with those patients. Let's go to the next slide. So if we think about an in-clinic e-consent process flow, and this is just using electronic tablet where patients are starting. Typically, when they're in clinic, they would start with the clinician sharing information on the tablet, passing that to the patient. The patient has the ability to go through a different type of process, watching a video, reading the informed consent, flagging information, going through and answering questions that they've learned, or questions about information they've learned through watching the video and reading the informed consent, to evaluate whether or not they have a good comprehension, deciding whether or not they want to join the study. They register, they make acknowledgments, they then sign on a tablet, pass the tablet back over. The site can review how the patient has interacted with that tablet, answer questions for them, discuss any questions they might have, and confirm, and then countersign, and then print a copy of that document. So there's a full functional process that takes place in a site-based e-consent process workflow. Well, with COVID-19, let's go to the next slide. COVID-19, this gets changed a bit because a patient can't come into the trial site. And so perhaps there is a way utilizing these same technologies to allow a patient to continue to go through the process, whereby presenting them with the information at home through a web platform. For Medidata, we give every study, we give them the ability to look at a web platform where they can watch the video, they can read the informed consent document, they can print the informed consent document, and then they could print and scan that document back over to the site. The site can go through a process of recording that as being a remote consent. And so you're still tracking it. They can still sign at the site level and countersign the document, send it back to the patient. So you still meet those requirements, or the intimacy of being able to pass the information back and forth, answer questions for the patient, either through a telephone call or through a telemedicine call, and be able to have the patient continue on the trial or continue with the process and have a copy of that document provided to them at the end. Let's go to the next slide. And there are, excuse me, there's a number of different ways of doing that, obviously. Some of the considerations as you're evaluating your trials to determine whether or not this is an appropriate approach, you should consult, especially with these guidance documents that are out and they're constantly changing, but consult with your own QA and compliance teams, and also with your IRB or ethics committee to make sure that they're in approval of the process changes that you're planning on taking. Looking at the interpretation of those may require involvement of your legal team as well. And one of the points I made down there, and maybe we can talk about this at the end if we have time, is really looking at these processes. They may have a short shelf life, post COVID-19 as we enter or exit this pandemic era. We don't know what the regulatory world will look like. We're getting some indication of it right now from the U.S. regulatory agencies, and maybe we'll see that worldwide as well. We think that some of these changes will be permanent and take place, but we're not guaranteed of that. Let's go to the next slide. So one other topic, I just wanted to highlight, this is a case study of a medical device company here in the US that's using eConsent. In this case, they used an EDC, eCOA, and eConsent all together. Their goal in utilizing eConsent was to provide more patient-centric capabilities, ways to educate patients more effectively, provide operational efficiencies for the entire team, for the sponsor team, for the site team, for the monitors, and provide centralized monitoring so they could reduce the costs that they had in sending monitors out to trial sites. And then also to address some of the reconsenting challenges that they had, where they were missing some of the patients that needed to come back in and reconsent, and being able to have clear line of vision with an electronic system where all parties involved have responsibility and accountability to each other, and you can see which patients have come back in and reconsented and which ones have not. I'm not going to read through that whole thing, but you know, the bottom line for them was they wanted to achieve this by the end of 2019, and have their first patient in 2020. They were able to get that up and running. I think it was about a 8 or 12 week process. Utilizing this platform in the way that I just described to you before, they can now, in a COVID-19 era, still conduct their study using eConsent, allowing the patient to review the materials at home, send those into the site without having to go to the trial site. Let's go to the next slide. So the other topic that I wanted to talk to you about, which is, I think, a hot topic in the industry right now, as we think about COVID-19, is providing video conferencing and telemedicine capabilities to your clinical trials. And this may already be in place on your studies, that you've started doing that. It's really a site-based focus in many instances, where a site may have a prohibition, or a state-based, because states have certain regulations on how clinicians can interact with patients with telemedicine. But I just wanted to go through just a few slides here, then we'll jump over to Paul. So Paul, go ahead and advance the next slide for me. Looking at the relevant regulations for telemedicine, there's been some changes recently with COVID-19 whereby the FDA is suggesting that it would be beneficial to add virtual visits, and making sure that those virtual visits include the use of appropriate telemedicine platforms, virtual tools, as different ways or different methods for sites to be able to engage with patients. Again, the key thing here is patient safety must be first, right? Finding ways that we can evaluate patients on a clinical trial. And this will not be true for, excuse me, for every study. There are cases where you still have to have patients come in for a blood draw, for some type of examination, but as much as possible, find ways that we can reach out to those patients, reduce the amount of time that they might spend in a clinic, or reduce the number of clinic visits, or eliminate clinic visits altogether. So the use of telehealth and telemedicine type tools is one way of doing that, and this has been cleared by the DHS and OCR in lifting some of the regulations for the enforcement discretion. Let's go to the next slide. Similarly, in Europe, in the UK and Europe, there is a call for reduction of site visits and mandating the use of phone calls instead of protocol-directed in-person studies, or replacing site visits with video calls or phone calls, and doing as much as we possibly can to reduce the amount of time that a patient spends in a clinic, or reducing clinic visits altogether. You know, making sure we continue to collect adverse events from the trial participant through alternative means as well, through phone calls, televisits, other types of devices, as much as we possibly can. So we see this big jump, and you're all familiar with some of the tools that are out there. We're using Zoom today. I found out that Zoom has a larger net worth right now than the top 7 airlines in the world combined. If you think about it, Continental, United and American, Delta, Southwest, all of those combined together, Zoom is worth more than they are. Incredible. But we're all touched by this whole idea of telemedicine and the way of using these types of tools. And as I talked about before, with with now much of the world, more than half of the world, having internet access and always on mobile access, it makes more sense for us to be able to find ways to reach out to those patients. Go ahead and let's go to the next slide. So as you think about the different types of technologies, there are some commercial technologies that are out there that are approved by Department of Health and Human Services. I shouldn't say they're approved. They're looked at by the Department of Health and Human Services as meeting the needs for HIPAA compliance, for example, within sites. So things like Skype for Business, Zoom for Healthcare, WebEx meetings, UpDocs, etc. I'm not suggesting that any of these are better than another, and I'm not advocating for any one than another, but they are tools that are available to you to use to engage with your patients remotely today. Let's go to the next slide. I think always preferred is finding a way to utilize in-house built technologies or in-app built technologies that are already covered by your regulatory approved products that you have. Medidata has a tool for conducting these visits. Paul will talk a little bit more about my Medidata as being the patient's personal access into a clinical trial, and how we are utilizing telemedicine and these types of tools to be able to allow our patients to connect with the PI and witnesses to be part of these as well, for case management, for e-consent, for verifying information and documentation. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to turn it back over to my good Irish colleague there, Paul. If you take us forward.
Thank you kindly, Michael. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking, Michael's obviously gone through some of the ways we've seen technology being used and technology evolving to support the e-consent process as well as the engagement process. I want to take us maybe back to a fundamental aspect of a clinical trial around the actual capture of data, specifically patient data, which is obviously a key element of demonstrating the efficacy or safety of any treatment or medical device, is getting that direct data from patients around how they're feeling and functioning. So to date, electronic clinical outcome assessments have really been traditional questionnaires, standard patient-reported outcomes, administered on screen-based technology. And for the last few decades where we've been using this eCOA technology, it's really been provision devices. We've been providing sites, normally tablet devices. We've been providing patients, back in the day, some kind of PDA, nowadays some kind of smartphone that they can actually bring home with them to respond to these questionnaires. More recently, in the last 5 years or so, there's been growing interest in so-called bring your own device, BYOD. And this being the idea of, as smartphones have become ever more saturated within patient populations, that we can maybe have patients install an app, for example, on their phone, where they can access these questionnaires and complete them there. That's, despite the fact it sounds like a straightforward process, that's still something of a evolving area of thinking, both from a regulatory and kind of a logistical perspective. And really the point I'm trying to make here is that to date, the mainstream method of capturing clinical outcome assessment data within pivotal clinical trials has really been this provision device solution, where we have a point solution where we're collecting these questionnaires and this data from patients using a piece of hardware that we're actually providing to them. As Michael kind of teased during his presentation, we at Medidata, while obviously providing and supporting that more traditional eCOA solution, and we will for the foreseeable future, it's going to be important in many different scenarios. We really wanted to go back to basics to think, was there a more fundamental change we could make to how we're engaging with patients within clinical trials? And that's where this concept of my Medidata comes from. And Michael's already kind of talked about this whole spectrum of the patient journey, starting from where they actually find out about the trial in the first place, through to learning about it, consenting to it, getting randomized into the study, then actually providing their data, going to visits or maybe having remote visits, all the way through to the end of that study. And so we envision our My Medidata solution as basically a patient portal, a single location, virtual location, where patients can engage with all aspects of their clinical trial. So it's not just a place for them to, for example, respond to questionnaires. It's a place for them to get information on their study, information on their next visits, information on how much longer they have to engage with the trial, information maybe on future clinical trials they might be interested in. And ultimately, and as Michael indicated, this is kind of an ongoing discussion, potentially a way for us to feed data back to patients as well. This product, which we launched just over a month ago now, leading with our COVID-19 tracker, this went through the patient centricity by design process that Michael described. So this is something we're very actively engaging with patients as we expand this My Medidata product to really become a centralized location for patients within clinical trials. And it's shifting how we're thinking about clinical trials, going from the trial being the center of everything and then kind of drawing the patients into that, to really shifting it to be truly patient-centric, if you will, where the patients become the center of their world. They get to control that, they get to control who plugs into that, and it gives them a way of understanding and engaging with trials in a space that they control. It was really driven by the sense that, you know, there's a number of challenges we see specifically for patients within clinical trials, and this is what we hear back from our patient advocates as well through our patient centricity by design. You know, they struggle to find out about trials in the first place. And very often, certainly for things like oncology studies, clinical trials are a patient's last hope in regards to getting access to treatment. So it's absolutely vital for them to really have a good understanding of what clinical trials might be appropriate for them and then their disease. Enrolling into trials can be a complicated process. Thankfully, with e-consent, as we've seen, that can significantly simplify that process. And the actual participation in the trial, it's a big thing we're asking patients to do. It's a significant burden to take part in clinical trials. It's a significant amount of time. It's a significant amount of effort, particularly if we have patients coming in for site visits and they have to take time off work, they have to travel. And so anything we can do to simplify that process, even if it's just as simple as providing them more insight into what's going to be expected from them, all the way through to actually allowing us to move a lot of those visits to be remote visits rather than having them to actually come into a physical location. And then that completion process, not getting any insight into what actually happened. They may have sank years of their lives into this clinical trial. And then once they get to the end of it, they don't hear anything else about it. So providing a platform where we can maybe maintain that engagement beyond just the clinical trial process. So we're really envisioning My Medidata as the industry's first actual patient portal. If anyone's familiar with Rave, that's very much a site portal where sites can have a centralized location for getting insight into the trials they're involved in. My Medidata is the exact same. It's a centralized patient portal where the patient can get insight into the trial they're engaged with and any potential other information or trials that might be useful for them. So that's specifically focusing on that kind of data capture and patient engagement piece. But when we look again to COVID-19, how has this impacted how we're thinking about the data capture piece within clinical trials? Michael's done a great job of talking about how the regulators have outlined their thinking around the consenting process and maybe telemedicine. They've obviously commented on the trial integrity as well. So there's been a lot of feedback, unsurprisingly, over the last couple of months from various regulators and IRBs around the response to COVID-19. There's a link here to a regularly updated blog post that we maintain in Medidata that tries to summarize a lot of this regulatory feedback. I think if you read between the lines, obviously it varies by regulator basis, but really we're probably seeing significantly more flexibility than maybe we're used to within this space, and I think that's right and understandable. We're trying to respond very rapidly to a patient safety issue, and to unfairly paraphrase the regulators, I think what they're saying is we need to respond to the patient safety issue first, obviously, but then we need to do what we can do to try and maintain the integrity of the trial in as much as continuing to capture what data we can capture, so that we're not just writing off these months and not gaining any insight into what the patients are going through as they're still engaged within this new treatment, within this new medical device scenario. So the industry has been trying to respond to this. They've been trying to respond to the regulators' feedback. And really what we're seeing is an assessment being made of balancing potentially missing data versus potentially capturing some data in what would, in traditional scenarios, be considered a suboptimal fashion. So the main situation when it comes to data capture that we see sponsors struggling with is where we had patients traditionally coming in for site visits, completing their questionnaires during that site visit. Now, in many scenarios, patients are no longer able to come in for their site visits because it's become a patient safety issue. And so how do we capture those data points that they would otherwise have been completing during that site visit? So obviously there's the option of not capturing that data at all. For many of these phase 2, phase 3 studies, which are potentially collecting pivotal data, that's not really a solution we want to look at. And so Medidata has been attempting to respond to that by supporting our clients shifting to at-home data capture. And there's a number of different options that we've been exploring and we have successfully launched. Probably the most common solution we've seen implemented has been over-the-phone interviews. And so the sites now, rather than the patient coming in for the study visit and completing their questionnaires on a site-based device, we have actually site staff interviewing patients over the phone to complete those questionnaires. And then they either enter that data into the site device, or in fact, they can enter that data directly into RAID EDC, so directly into the study EDC. The other solution we've been helping some sponsors explore has been shifting to this BYOD model. So again, rather than having patients complete their questionnaires on a site-based device, in fact, we've been, in some situations, able to push those questionnaires to the patient's own devices. So they'll be able to log into an app-based version of our eCOA solution where they can interact with their typically site-based devices, but are on their own device. And this has allowed us to maintain some level of data integrity and maintain the flow of the clinical trial while the patients have been unable to come in for their site-based visits. A lot of that, those solutions that we've been exploring in Medidata are echoed more broadly across the industry. One major resource, if anyone is out there struggling with this kind of mid-study changes, comes from the Critical Path Institute, specifically the ePro Consortium and the PRO Consortium. Medidata is very actively involved in the ePro Consortium. It's a consortia of vendors, the leading vendors. There's 13 of us involved in it at the moment within the eCOA space, where we come together to try and advance the science of technology-driven data capture within clinical trials. And so obviously in response to the challenges sponsors were facing in COVID-19, we came together with the PRO Consortium, which is a sponsor group, to really try and outline some of these potential responses, as well as very clearly document some of the challenges that all of these solutions face. Again, it's a challenging situation of there's not necessarily a perfect solution. Anytime you're very rapidly trying to respond to an issue in the middle of a clinical trial, there's not necessarily perfect solutions. And so this document, I encourage everyone who's maybe struggling with this topic at the moment to take a look at this, because it very clearly outlines both the regulatory landscape relating to eCOA, but also some of the solutions, as well as clearly documenting the various pros, cons, and considerations around those. So I think to wrap up and just encourage everyone to submit any questions you might have, and inviting Michael back into the conversation. I really feel a lot of what we've seen, I think everything we've presented, both myself and Michael have presented over the last 40 minutes or so, none of this technology is new. This is technology we've been engaging with and using in varying degrees across clinical trials for the last 5, 10, when it comes to eCOA, 20 years. What I think we're probably seeing within our response to COVID-19, largely driven a lot by this kind of regulatory flexibility, as well as the need to allow patients to engage with the clinical trial in a more remote technology-driven setting, I think what we're probably seeing is the acceleration of a lot of these trends that we've been talking about for, in some case, decades. I don't think there's necessarily anything brand new that we're rolling out here. It's rather we're leveraging technology and solutions we already had, and sometimes being confronted with, difficult conversations. So I touched on bring your own device earlier as kind of an evolution within the eCOA space. Before COVID-19 happened, there was still a lot of regulatory uncertainty around the acceptability of that as a solution for supporting pivotal endpoints in clinical trials. And I think now that we've seen BYOD as a potential acceptable solution to try and maintain the integrity of the clinical trial, I think it's really going to advance that conversation, because we'll see, in fact, that it is a viable solution. We'll see that we can capture data using BYOD solutions in a way that can support these pivotal endpoints in clinical trials. And I think that's similar across e-consent and virtualization, and more broadly, potentially patient platforms. But Michael, I don't know what your thoughts in that regard are.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing an adoption curve that I think is a little bit faster than what we saw with EDC when it first came out. But changing policies, I've worked in the space for since the early beginnings of e-consent, for example, and worked directly with regulators like MHRA and HRA and FDA to adopt e-consent and start to find ways to allow sponsors to use it. And it's not a fast process, but it's not too slow of a process either. I think COVID-19 has, as you say, expedited that and moved it forward. And now, instead of people saying, well, should I really try it? Is it really something that's going to change in the industry? Everybody's saying, I need to have it now. And how can we make this work? And the regulators recognizing the need for patients who are on these trials, who need to continue standard of care on the trials, to be able to access their sites and their PIs. Paul, I see one question out here from Shirley saying, will the FDA accept the app-based data as source data? And how should we SDV this type of information? What about wearables and sensors? And is FDA willing to evolve with the changing technology? Are they even thinking about this?
Yeah, great. There's a lot in those questions. Thank you very much. Great questions. Let me start with the maybe the kind of source data question. So the FDA very much will accept data that's captured through a solution that's app-based. So Medidata's eCOA solution is in fact app-based. We very often have that app just installed on provisioned devices. That's completely locked down, so patients can't do anything but interact with the eCOA system. But we also have successfully deployed BYOD studies where patients have installed the app on their own device. And it's the exact same experience as if they've used a provisioned device, because it's the same app in both instances. And the regulators are very comfortable with that. Obviously, it has the various security and privacy requirements built into it. From a source data point of view, it's very clear that the regulators accept that the source data is the data that hits the study EDC once it's pushed off the actual eCOA device. So the source data is that data that ends up in your study EDC. So in regards to source data verification, there's no need for what you might be familiar with from a paper world in regards to having to obviously compare against something else, because there is nothing else to compare against. The data that's entered into the app gets pushed directly through to the EDC system, and that is your fundamental source data. It's one of these key benefits that eCOA brings. It removes that huge chunk of time and resources that SDV tends to have within the paper world. The wearable question is a great one. We could have a whole webinar about that one. I'll just briefly say that there is a huge amount of interest in wearables and sensors. It's recognized that they have the potential to not only support traditional types of questionnaires that we use to gain insight into the patient experience of kind of kind of supporting traditional PROs, patient-reported outcomes, but also give us a whole new insight into the patient experience, a whole new way of understanding the patient experience over time, much more fine-grained insight, and measuring completely new things. The regulators recognize that there's a lot of potential there. I will say my sense and the industry sense is we're at very early days. I think we're still getting our heads around what we should be measuring using wearable devices and what's the best way of going about doing that. And so the regulators are really encouraging, the industry, the vendors, the sponsors to come to them with use cases. And those use cases, we have to approach this in the right way. We can't say we have this shiny new device we want to use in this clinical trial and then figure out what we're going to do with it. We have to kind of come at it from the other way, which is we want to measure this, whatever this is, but we know this is important to the patients. We know this is important in this disease. We know this is important with this treatment. And we feel this is the right wearable sensor to measure that and give us insight into that. That's what we should be approaching the regulators with. And there are a number of initiatives ongoing with DIA, ISPOR, and CPAT as well to try and standardize how we're approaching that in the industry. So it's very early days, but I think wearables and sensors hold a lot of potential for showing us interesting things within the clinical trial space.
So Paul, one of the key things as we start talking about BYOD, obviously people have a concern about personal devices being used versus a provision device. Izzy asks, can you talk about the effect of monitoring of clinical trials if the BYOD is used in a clinical trial? How does that differ from a provision device?
Yeah, so depending what you mean by monitoring. So if monitoring in the sense of having the site staff maintain that connection with the patients, ensuring that the patients are completing their questionnaires when they're meant to be completing it, keeping an eye on things like adverse events potentially, that all remains the exact same actually as a traditional provisioned solution. Again, that data all flows through directly into the study EDC. And once it hits the EDC, we can trigger any kind of notification or warning that we might want, whether that be, this patient hasn't completed their daily diary for the last 3 days, you might want to check in with them, or this patient has reported a worsening of symptoms, you might want to check in with them. So all of that remains the exact same. So the solution is really the same. It's just being administered through the patient's own device rather than a provisioned device. Again, the hardware tends to be very similar, where Medidata tend to be provisioning things like iPhones and Samsung smartphones for our provision solution, which is very often the devices patients have themselves.
And I'll just add to that, I've been working with virtual trials now for about 10 years. The first trial we actually did was the Pfizer remote study, which was completely web-based. And it was patients providing their own devices, whether it was through a laptop, a computer, a smart device, smartphone, or early versions of the tablets. But they were accessing the system and then putting data into the system. And this was a FDA-regulated study, and the FDA was closely monitoring it and giving feedback constantly on how we were collecting data. And many of the things that we see today in the concepts of ECOA that we're utilizing, and many of the things that we're bringing into the My Medidata platform are a result of those early studies where we got a lot of feedback from the regulators and what needed to be there and being able to collect data, but also looking at the use of an instrument on a device and whether or not a form look the same on a 4-inch iPhone versus a 6-inch iPhone, and how the patient would react to that. So I think it's really interesting to see the changes in technology that are allowing us to scale and give patients the freedom of being able to utilize their own devices and participate in a clinical trial. One of the other questions came in is, do we see opportunities for using this approach for data capture in the post-market environment as well? And absolutely, I think as we think about post-market, as we think about observational studies, as we think about FDA, PMA, conditions of approval studies, PMS, et cetera, these types of technologies will be key to allowing patients to share information remotely. Amir asked the name of the study I was talking about. It was the Pfizer remote study, REMOTE study. There's another one that's currently running. It's not a FDA study. It's a post-market study called Adaptable. It's the aspirin study, looking at which version or which dose of aspirin is more effective and safer to use for cardiac patients. That one has currently 15,000 patients that are completely remote. So these are patients that came in, went through a remote consent utilizing their own devices, and also have gone through and conducted about 75,000 virtual visits, never going to a trial site, but instead sharing all of their information through the internet on their own devices. And that particular trial is kind of interesting, and this question usually comes up when we talk about these technologies, is what about older populations? With Adaptable, the average age of the user on that study is 67 years old. We have patients that are in their 80s and 90s. They're participating, and they're equally competent of using the technology to be able to share their information from home. Excuse me. And as they use the technologies, we're able to measure the types of technologies that are being used. So about 60% of those, or 67% actually, are coming in through traditional desktop or laptop devices, and the rest are coming in through mobile devices, which include smartphones and tablets and readers that can connect to the internet.
Michael, one thing you kind of touched on very briefly during some of your slides was about, we've obviously seen this very rapid, unusually rapid response from the regulators in regards to trying to provide some regulatory space, let's say, for people to operate as they respond to COVID-19. But what's your sense, that the pandemic will pass, whether months or a year or more, but it will pass. What's your sense as we start going back to some level of whatever normality is, of how this kind of regulatory guidance we've seen pushed out in the last couple of months, will it still apply? Will we see a return to where we were before? What's your sense of how things will evolve?
Well, we're seeing some indications of that. FDA in the last week and a half have released some indication that the guidance document that they've put in place will maintain as a standard now. So it will continue to encourage remote participation by patients where possible, utilizing these types of technologies. So I think that's a positive sign in the industry. There are going to be some more conservative regulatory agencies that may pull back some of those in the EU, for example. And the EU highly relies on the member states to make decisions themselves based on their own regulations. Obviously, the concern for many is protection of data privacy and ensuring that good standards are put in place. So I think even with guidance documents or guidances that are out there, there will still be a high degree of scrutiny from a regulatory perspective to make sure that the technologies that are being used are appropriate and that they safeguard patients' safety, patient information, and personal information.
Yeah.
So gentlemen, we are bumped up here against the hour. I wanted to just, if there's any last questions out there, feel free to fire them in. Paul, you did actually take a question I had just about, because I was interested in what you said about these are really regulatory innovations in many ways. What we're experiencing now is sort of use case scenarios for technologies that have been in there, and it's up to the regulators in some ways to take it from here. I don't know if anybody has an example of where a regulator has extended these conditions and then pulled them back. Michael, do you have any history of that?
We haven't seen it yet, Brian. I think we're all still kind of suffering through the pandemic as we see numbers continuing to rise, especially in South America and places like India and Asia. So I think there's going to be some extension of these for a period of time. I think many of the regulators are still concerned that there's going to be a second wave of the pandemic, so they don't want to pull back on them too quickly. I think the caution out there is, let's not replace the face-to-face interaction of patients and PIs, because there are still patients that want to have that interaction. There are still patients that want that, the assurance of visiting with a doctor who's giving them the comfort of knowing, what's going on with their condition, et cetera. So I think we need to approach this cautiously. And the one thing that I've taken from all of this, as I've talked to patients and listened to sponsors, is as we come out of this, we should make it more of a choice for patients to decide how they want to participate in a clinical trial. So as we introduce technologies, not every patient will want to use those technologies. Not every patient will want to have a completely virtual experience. They may want to still have that face-to-face experience, and they may want to have some hybrid level where some site visits are done electronically and some are done remotely. And I think the regulators recognize that and are probably considering very closely how to best administer that and ensure the safety of the patient, number one, and then the integrity of the data.
Well, yeah, and I saw Shirley says that there's the biggest fear, right, for an innovator is using money to put these protocols in place, and the FDA changes the playing field on you. So
yeah,
I don't know if there's any quick advice on how you do that in terms of, start sooner or talk to talk to the FDA.
Yeah, I think the regulators have made, the FDA in particular has made very clear that, they will happily talk to people who want to do innovative things. They recognize the technology is evolving. They recognize the potential in the technology. And, particularly when it comes to wearables and sensors, they're really crying out for people to come to them with innovative and useful and meaningful ways of using this technology. So really encouraging not to be afraid to go and talk to the FDA.
Great. Well, gentlemen, that's a really packed hour of great information. I want to thank you both for joining us. I want to thank everybody who joined us on this webinar. As I said, we have recorded this and we can make these slides available to all attendees. This is the first of 3 sessions we're doing in conjunction with Medidata on clinical trials and the future of how clinical trials are going to progress through COVID and post-COVID. I want to thank our partners, and I hope everyone has a safe and productive day. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thanks for having us,
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.